You're listening to Season 2 of the Mies podcast. I'm your host, Josh Sharkey, the founder and CEO of Mies, a culinary operating system for food professionals. On the show, we're going to talk to high performers in the food business, everything from chefs to CEOs, technologists, writers, investors, and more, about how they innovate and operate and how they consistently execute at a high level, day after day. And I would really love it if you could drop us a 5-star review anywhere that you listen to your podcast. That could be Apple, that could be Spotify, it could be Google. I'm not picky. Anywhere works, but I really appreciate the support. And as always, I hope you enjoy the show.
With every stroke of the pencil, I'm giving you folks a glimpse into my experiences you could trace like.
My guest today is the co-founder and CEO of MarginEdge, a back office technology for restaurants, connecting accounting, POS, and more. So all your kitchen operations. His name is Bo Davis. Bo and I met years ago, actually, while I was still running restaurants, and we've been friends ever since. He's one of those people that you realize more and more over time how smart they really are. Bo actually dropped out of high school, which I didn't know, but he still managed to get 2 master's degrees, one in finance, and then 30 years later, another degree in data science from Northwestern. So he's definitely an avid learner, and he's built several successful companies. So before MarginEdge, he had a couple others. He had restaurants and another tech company. Most importantly for him, recently, MarginEdge won 7th out of the entire country from Glassdoor of best places to work. So we talk a lot about some of the tactical advice related to building great culture. Before digging into restaurant unit economics, the good, the bad, and the sometimes scary, I'm curious what you think about our last topic as we start to talk about what it's like to be an entrepreneur and what it means to be an entrepreneur. So shoot me a DM if you agree or disagree or just any thoughts that you have. I'd love to hear what you think. And as always, I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the show. We're live. So
Thank
you're here.
you. Super excited to be here, Josh. I look forward to talking to you. I always enjoy our conversation, so doing it recorded should be interesting.
I know. Well, I find I'm usually picking your brain anyways, so I'm going to take today to pick your brain even more. I'm going to wind everyone up a little bit, and then maybe you can fill in the blanks about your background, because it's pretty impressive.
It's a little
I didn't know.
It's a little random, but
I didn't know you actually dropped out of high school, yet still have 2 master's degrees. That's
a little random,
awesome.
as I said. It's a little
And you started a company long before MarginEdge, and you also obviously started restaurants, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But an educational platform that you sold to Blackboard. What I didn't know, I knew you were like digging into data science recently. Obviously, you went to college. I'm not going to know how many decades ago. It was a while
it's been
ago.
a minute.
Yeah, but like literally 2 years ago, you got a master's from Northwestern in data science, which I had no idea.
Yep.
I knew you were taking classes. I thought they were like a fun little laissez-faire nighttime data science class, but you actually got a degree in data science.
Yeah, it's
That's
actually
insane.
it's technically artificial intelligence, and it's out of the engineering school at Northwestern.
That's amazing, man.
It was fun.
Well, can you just fill in the blanks a little bit about?
Yeah,
who you
so
are?
it is a little bit of a random walk. So I'm a high school dropout, went to community college, ended up getting out of college forever, but finally graduated, and then started a software company right out of college, higher ed tech, as you mentioned, a company called Prometheus that I sold to Blackboard. And that was 27 years ago. So I started that in 97. It was actually my first job out of college. So I was a kid. And then I wasn't sure what to do. So my wife and I went into the Peace Corps. So we moved to Eastern Europe, did a couple years in the Peace Corps, still wasn't sure what to do. So I went to graduate school and did my first master's in finance in London. And there decided to go into the restaurant business with a couple buddies. And so we hired a chef out of London and moved to DC, opened our first restaurant, did that for 10 years. And then in 2015, started MarginEdge.
So you and your wife were both in the Peace Corps together?
Yeah, so we got engaged when I was running my first company, my first software company back in the 90s. And then when I sold the company, we weren't sure what we wanted to do. And she had just finished a master's in history, and I just, had an exit. So I had flexibility, and we realized that this was probably the only point in our lives that we would have that flexibility until we retired. And so we were brainstorming ideas, and she said, I always wanted to join the Peace Corps when I was in college. And so we looked into it, and it felt like a great chance to give back and go see the world. And so, we spent 2 years in Eastern Europe together. She was a teacher of English. I was doing economic development in a little tiny town called Kriva Palanka in the corner of Serbia, Bulgaria, and Macedonia, middle of nowhere. It was definitely a learning experience.
So my sister was in the Peace Corps in Mali,
cool.
in West Africa for a few years, and then she went back to Malawi. I think actually not for the Peace Corps at that point, but originally the Peace Corps in Mali. But it was a process. And to get it's somewhat random who got in where, like how did you and your wife end up getting to the same place?
So the deal with the Peace Corps is if you are married upon application, you go together. So we actually got assigned together. Their story's a little bit funny though, in that we applied and we wanted to go to Russia and we got accepted and we're going to Russia. We got married in June. We were leaving in August. And in July of that year, Putin threw the Peace Corps out of Russia. And so we were then homeless for like 6 months until they found a new assignment for us. So we ended up in Eastern Europe.
Awesome. You have a couple kids, at least a couple.
3. Yeah.
How old are they again?
8.
I know this, by the way. I'm just letting the audience know.
It changes every 4 months, so it's fair. 18, 16, and 13.
I actually been talking about this a lot lately on the podcast with other parents who are not even just like CEOs, but just that have jobs. But like, how has now it's been quite a while, over a decade of being a parent. Like, how does it impact the way that you lead your company?
The more important thing fundamentally is how it impacted how I work. And then from that, how that impacted the company. And like the interesting thing for me is I had my first child and my first restaurant basically back to back. So in 2005, my wife had our first child. It's when we moved back from London and we opened our first place here in DC. And so, the whole sort of early childhood, first 10 years for my kids, I was a restaurant operator. I had restaurants in California, Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, DC, and young children. And I would say from the very beginning, I was extremely dedicated to making sure that I made time for the kids and spent a lot of time with them. And, restaurants are obviously wildly demanding, as we all know, and wildly stressful. And, I opened a fair number of restaurants that failed, right? And I had broken leases and fights with landlords and had to let people go and all the stresses that come with that. And I would say that through that period, having that really tight relationship with the family and making time with the kids helped keep me sane, because it really was a very, very emotionally difficult time period, particularly the last like 3 years. And so to me, that during that time period, I just learned how important it was to have a balance that wasn't just all work because of how difficult it was. And so as we started this company, MarginEdge, it was really fundamental to me that the work-life balance thing wasn't just something that was on paper or something that we bragged about on LinkedIn, but was fundamental to the company. And so, yeah, it's had a deep impact, I think.
It's amazing that you're able to do that. How?
Can I tell you one of my favorite bragging points, Josh, as a parent? One of my favorite bragging points, and I think this blows people's minds a little bit. So during those years, right, restaurant operator, restaurants all over the place, I attended every field trip my kids went on in elementary school that I could get into. And I know your kids are a little younger, but as they get into like kindergarten and first grade, it's competitive to get in those field trips. And then as they get into like 5th and 6th grade, parents don't want to go anymore, so it's easy. But like, I was like first email the teacher to go on field trips. And I did literally red eyes back from restaurant meetings, from meetings in California to get back and get on a field trip. But I went on all of them. Like I made the fucking time, right? Like that's how life works. You either make the time or you don't. And I made the time.
Obviously, I have 2 kids, but my kids were born as I was building a technology company. But most of my life was running restaurants.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine like how it would work, working 15, 16, 18-hour days. How do you did you put it into the calendar? Did you have some sort of agreement with your wife about what the times would be? And
yeah, I mean, I will say, so my wife was not working, which is super helpful, right? So we definitely had a she was a stay-at-home mom. And so that gave us a lot of flexibility. How long was that for? Basically the whole time they were in elementary school. She went back to work. She'd kill me if I said I didn't know, but I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. But basically the whole time they were young, she was at home. And that definitely gave flexibility, right? So it wasn't like I was the primary caretaker at any point. Mm-hmm. But my first restaurant, we were busy. Lunches were the main business. And then we were, there was nothing in the mornings. And so in the mornings, I spent time with the kids. And I just always made a point of carving out that time. And look, some of it is delegation. As a owner, I probably have more room to delegate than others, but I just always made it a priority. And I think it's a lot about work, and it's true in the software company too. A lot about work is how you approach it. And, you can allow any job to take up all of your time. I mean, you can be whatever, any role, and you can work all the time and you can throw yourself into it, and that can be your personal identity. And you see that, right, with a lot of people. And for me, I never allowed it to be my personal identity. It was a thing that I did. And I dedicated the time I needed to it. And certainly there were times where it was shit, I have to do a thing and I didn't have complete control. But I always balance that with, no, that's not my personal identity. My personal identity is broader than that. And I made the time to do the other thing.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you're doing, it works because you have an incredible company and,
Thank you.
you know, 3 almost fully grown
Three
children.
kids that haven't killed me or each other yet. So that's a thing.
Yeah. I find that I have to, like, my calendar is everything, right? So, like, I literally have
Oh, I do too. Yeah.
the playtime for the kids in the morning and the playtime.
Yeah. So I didn't do that in the restaurant business because you know how the restaurant business is.
Yeah,
It's less like that. But yeah, since the software company for the last 8 years, absolutely. Yeah. No, the carving out time. And I even do like a couple hours a day that I carve out for focus time that is just recurring meetings in my calendar. Sometimes you have to give them up, but I try to make sure I have time to think and not just go from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. I do the same thing.
Nice.
I feel like I keep talking about this app and I have to stop because it sounds like I'm selling it, but there's this app called Reclaim
Oh,
that I'm like obsessed with.
Nice.
And it's like a calendar app, but it uses AI to rearrange your calendar and you create these habits. So I have a habit for strategy and I have a habit that's like, you know, X amount of time per week for strategy and for
I'm writing it down.
email catch up.
Make sure you get your commission.
Yeah, I should get commission from them. And it rearranges, but it makes sure no matter what, you still get the strategy time. Because that was the hard part for me.
Yeah.
It's like Maria on my team takes care of my calendar, but she's like, can I just make your strategy time less? Because I don't know what to do with this thing. And it just solved a huge problem there. So there's a couple like things I want to like dive into today with you, if it's okay.
Of course.
Because one is, you know, on the finance side, because you know a lot about that. I've learned a lot from you over the years, not just as it relates to like tech companies, but restaurants specifically.
Yeah.
And then just your perspective on what it's been like to build a company and the delta between like what it was like 2 decades ago when you first started doing it to now.
Sadly, Josh, as I was thinking about this, it's 397. So I'm pushing 3 decades.
3 decades ago. I'm careful not to.
No, it's okay.
But you know what? So what has changed the most? I mean, obviously you created your first company almost 3 decades ago, sold it to a pretty large, you know, education platform, started this new company. What are the biggest differences that, you know, we know everything that's the same. What are the biggest differences today from, you know, back then?
I mean, I think what was pretty wild about when I got started and I was actually coding in 96 and we really started selling the software in 97. What was really wild about that time period was that the internet was like, I mean, technically the infrastructure wasn't new, but the internet was coming out to the world, right? Like Amazon was a new thing. Google wasn't a thing, right? Like it was still very, very early. And if anything, it was mainly brochureware, right? There were a bunch of websites where you could like learn a thing, but there wasn't a ton that was very interactive and there wasn't much shopping or whatever. And so in those days, it was like the Wild West. Like, I mean, honestly, venture capitalists were just like, money around. Like nobody knew what the hell it was going to look like in the end. And a lot of people had a lot of different ideas. And frankly, I got extremely lucky because I was, 22, had never worked for anybody in my life and got funding for a fucking software company. There was no reason that I should have gotten funding for that thing. Yeah, it was definitely the Wild West. And as anyone who was around at that time knows, it ended fairly ugly with the 2001 crash of the .com bubble because people got a little bit over their skis. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing. Certainly the when you think about SaaS, for example, right, we have all these metrics now. And I know I've seen your numbers, you've seen my numbers, right? It's all about like retention, ARPU, and whatever, all the different acronyms. None of that existed. Like my first company in 97, we charged an annual subscription fee, but it wasn't called software as a service. That didn't exist, right? And so like all that sort of knowledge and math and all of that was just still coming around. And that was certainly interesting. And then the other thing is like, there was no cloud. Like there was the internet, but everyone had to run their own servers. So we had a machine room, right, that had stacks of servers and we had our own database administrators and everything that had to run, Linux admins and all that stuff that had to run all of the layers of software. So the incremental cost to start a software company was materially higher than it is today. And so that also pretty dramatically changed the landscape of what the companies were. You needed more capital. Now, as you know, like 2 guys and an AWS account can actually get something on the web that's dynamic pretty easily. Now, it might not be powerful or scalable, but it at least looks like something.
Yeah. Independent of like the mechanics of starting a business and the infrastructure that's involved, like, is there anything as it relates to people or how you build processes or culture that is just, in some ways, some sort of paradigm shift or much different today than it was 30 years ago? Obviously, 30 years ago was also pre-social media. It was pre kind of, a lot of those Me Too, these kinds of things. Did that have any impact?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously there's been lots of evolution of all of that. It has been a long time. I think, the mechanics are completely different, right? It used to be waterfall, right? You would develop software, you would release it once a year, and then you would spend a year debugging and getting ready for the next big release. And so, yeah, there's tons of like mechanical things like that have changed. But honestly, no, I mean, I think a lot of the fundamental stuff is the same. I mean, I have aged and matured and learned a lot, obviously, over the last 30 years doing this. And so the culture in my company today is radically different than my culture in 27 years ago. 27 years ago, it was like heads down, work, 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 work. And like, just, it was like just no perspective at all on anything. So that has all changed completely. But I don't think the overall business environment is still very similar, right? The things that are important are still important. And, like the you mentioned the Me Too and the DEI and all that stuff. Like, I think that's more in the forefront today. But I mean, we were talking about that 20 years ago, right? I mean, like, equality is not new.
Yeah.
It might be a little more in the forefront than it was in the past, and the acronyms may have changed, but, treating people equally and promoting everyone properly and that stuff is
Yeah. I mean, those are pretty universal.
core values, right? Like,
yeah. People don't change much. But, at least with MarginEdge, I mean, you've won some pretty incredible awards related to people, right? Just like best places to work. And I know that means a lot
I'm
to you.
super proud of the one we just won, which is on Glassdoor. So, a lot of these things you have to apply for. So there's a limited number of companies applying at any given time. So I'm still very proud of winning any of them. But like the Glassdoor one, they actually go into their data set. You don't apply, you don't submit anything, and they only use the analytics on their own data set. And they only have 2 categories for the entire country: above 1,000 employees and below 1,000 employees. So whether you're a electrical firm or whatever, anything, you're in that category. So we're in the sub 1,000, obviously, and we got 7th place in the country for best places to work.
That's nuts.
Across all
That's amazing,
industries.
man.
Like, how cool is that, right? Like, super, super stoked.
What do you think it is? Like, what is it about the culture that you're building?
I mean, look, there's a few things that I think are super important. I think at the top of it, though, I would say there was a really good mix at the very beginning between one of my co-founders, Roy Phillips, and myself, where Roy, like, I think I had a lot of the sort of basic fundamental beliefs about the importance of work-life balance and that stuff. Like, so it wasn't like a philosophical difference between the two of us. But what he had that I didn't is that he was really intentional about thinking about the culture of the company. So if I think about the company I had before, Wasabi, the restaurants, like, I acted very similarly, but I was less focused on like, are we treating everyone, and does everyone have the ability to go on a field trip with their kids, right? Like, I just was less focused on that and more focused on whatever. And with Roy, and when we started MarginEdge, he had come out of the Outback Group, which had focused really heavily on culture for decades, and he had spent 25 years there. And so he and I, from the beginning, were like, okay, we're going to be really intentional about the philosophy, which both of he and I agreed on the fundamentals, but we're going to be really intentional that is applied to the organization, and that we focus on that from the beginning in the early hires and what we talk about. And as we scale, we were going to continue to focus on it in a really meaningful way. And to this day, this is Roy's primary job with MarginEdge, is focusing on the culture. And so we were super intentional about it. And I think it matters. Like, I think you have to be.
Yeah. So, I mean, tactically, what are some of the things that you do to be intentional about it?
Well, I think some of it evolves with different stages in the company. I would say early on, we're still careful about who we hire, obviously, but in the beginning, we were super careful about who we hired, right? When you're 5 people and you're going to 6, that's 20% of your company, and you need to make, there can be no room for error. And so, we made sure we found the right people, and we can talk a little bit about what that means. But early on, I think it was more about that. As we got into a certain size, so currently we're 250 people in the US and 800 overseas. As we got to a certain size, it got more about trying to systematize and standardize. And I'll say, I also have a tool that I would recommend that I also do not get commission for, but I'm a huge believer in. Somebody else at a company whose culture I admired told me about. It's called Office Vibe. And so,
we use that.
Do you?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah,
I'm sure I gave you the speech previously.
I think you told me about it. Yeah.
So basically, for those who don't, it's what's called a pulse survey. And so basically, every 2 weeks, every employee in the company, all 250 people, will get 5 questions. But the 5 questions are randomized across the 250 people, and all of the 250 people ladder up in the organization. So the sales team goes to sales manager, goes to director, goes to head of sales, right? So you can see statistically significant information across your entire team and across like 15 different segments of information. Like, what do they think about compensation? What do they think about their work-life environment? Blah, 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 blah. And so we've been doing this for years. And so we can look in there and we can see down to, it's anonymized, but down to groups of 5, who's happy, who's not, what they're happy about, what they're not. And honestly, I think the most valuable thing, like I'd love to say I'm a data person, as you said. I'd like to say the data is what drives us, but honestly, it's really not. What really drives us out of that is that there's one question, which is open, right? They can write text. And I don't know, we've used it for like 4 or 5 years. I've read every single anonymous text message from every single person that has posted in the company. And I respond to the ones that are relevant, and I pull in people where needed, and I do the things, right? And their managers are also reading it. And so there is this great channel for everyone to speak up and be heard. And I think that's recognized. Another thing I did during tactical, so I'm giving you tactical. Another thing I did during COVID is, reading about how people are dealing with it. I got this idea from someone about a water cooler session. So I have an hour a day that is set into 3 20-minute segments that are water cooler. And I have the link that's out to the whole company. And the description of the meeting is like, I ran into you at the water cooler. You don't have to have an agenda. You don't have to have a target. You don't have to come to me to report on anything. We're just going to bullshit. And so we'll get on the phone and, I'll talk to people about their kids. I'll talk to them about what they like or don't like. I'll talk to them about their career path, or I'll talk to them about an issue they're having in MarginEdge and how I can coach them. And so it's just a low bar way for people to communicate. And I think those kinds of things, that openness, that transparency, those are a couple examples. The other one is we're just super transparent on all of our reporting. So whether it's good news or bad news, it's transparent. And I think a lot of companies are transparent when it's good and spinning when it's bad, and people can see through that shit. And so, some of my favorite moments have been, when I look back, are the hardest times where we leaned into the difficult decision of being super transparent when things were bad. And people on my exec team and others were like, that's not what you're supposed to do. And we were like, nope, that's what we're going to do. And it works every single time. People want to help. They want to lean in. They want to be supportive. They don't get scared off as easily as you think they do. And frankly, if they do get scared off, fine. Yeah. Like, let them go. Keep moving.
I 100% agree. And we take the same approach. And people surprise you so much. If you're just completely honest with them and you bring them in and make them part of the solution, they want to, right?
Yeah. And honestly, one of my biggest lessons in the last few years through COVID was, and it's one of these things that philosophically makes sense, but in practice, almost no one does it. And that is, humans actually like to share pain. Like they are open to sharing pain. They get value out of taking part of the pain, and they want to then help solve the problem. And what I mean is, when COVID first hit, we looked at laying off, I forget the numbers, but we were going to lay off 30 or 40% of the people to get our cash flow where it needed to be because our revenues were dropping. And at the last minute, the exec team was like, you know what? Instead of that, we're going to cut everyone's pay. And we cut everyone's pay, developers, sales, literally execs, everyone's pay. And we're like, sorry, we're going to do this. And we don't even know how long we're going to do it for. But we're going to cut pay until our revenues get back up. And then we're going to bring everybody back. Now, the playbook is let go of 30%, spare pain from the 70%, do it quick, do it deep, and then move on. And we did the opposite, right? It was neither quick nor was it localized. We shared the pain. No one quit. Like, even the developers who were still hot and everybody wanted engineers, nobody quit. We got through it. We went back to normal salaries. And that was the first year we won a Best Place to Work award, right? Everyone dug in because they don't mind sharing the pain. They want to help.
Yeah. It's funny how contrarian that is. I mean, the advice you get from every single, not just investor, but employment attorney from every people advisor is do it quick, make the cut, make it very clear, make it big enough that you don't have to do it again, and just communicate very clearly what's going on. I don't think I've heard anybody. I mean, it's tough. You have to get everybody to buy into that, but I think it's that risk is really beautiful, right? When they all do buy in and say, yeah, we'll take the cut, even though we don't know how long it's going to be for. I'm sure all of them are now back up to their.
Yeah. So I mean, it turned out it was about 6 months, and I mean, it was pretty wild. I will say that was a riskier decision, but in retrospect, it is actually the easy decision because it's just the right thing to do, right? Like, instead of localize the pain on some people, everybody take a piece.
This show is brought to you by, you guessed it, Mees. Mies helps thousands of restaurants and food service businesses all over the world build profitable menus and scale their business successfully. If you're looking to organize your recipe IP and train your team to put out consistent product every day in less time than ever before, then Mies is just for you. And you can transform all those old Google Docs and Word docs and PDFs and spreadsheets and Google Sheets into dynamic, actionable recipes in Mies in lightning speed. Plus, stop all that manual work of processing invoices because Mies will digitize all your purchases automatically. And there's a built-in database of ingredient yields, prep yields, and unit of measure conversions for every ingredient, which means you're going to get laser-accurate food costs in a fraction of the time. Visit www.getmees.com. That's GETMEEZ.com to learn more. And check out the show notes moving forward because we're going to be adding promotions and discount codes so that all of you lovely and brilliant Mies podcast listeners get a sweet deal on Mies. So you were talking about your partners a bunch, and I've had business partners in previous restaurants. Things have gone good, things have gone bad.
Yeah.
You have multiple partners, right? So there's Roy, and then there's a couple other involved, right?
Yeah, so there are basically 5 of us with MarginEdge when we started. 3 of us are still with the company, 2 are not. Yeah, I'll say with all 3 companies, I had co-founders, and I've had the full range of disaster, like out of the gate, and total success, still working together after 8-10 years, and everything in between. I think the advice that I give founders, and I give this very strongly, is the relationship between co-founders will be directly proportional to the clarity of the separation agreement. In other words, if it is very clear that if you're going to break up, it's going to look like a certain thing, it takes an enormous amount of pressure out of the relationship. And this is another thing that might feel a little contrarian, but like you hear this all the time. I heard this just recently. Yeah, but people basically think that they're so sure they're going to work together that they don't need to plan for that. And then they act like, if you talk to them candidly, they're concerned about what that discussion will be and what laying that process will look like out. And I always say to them, like, if you can't decide that, but you're going to run a company and build $1 billion organization together and go through 1,000 complexities, maybe you're not as close as you think you are. Maybe you don't have as good working relationship as you think you are. This should actually be fairly straightforward, right? So like having that conversation, laying it out, it makes all the difference in the world.
No, that's super helpful. And even just the notion of lay out your separation agreement out front, because I think a lot of folks might not even think to do that.
Right.
The other thing I've learned is that it's so important to be crystal clear on separation of responsibilities. Because what ends up happening is, you have a partner, a couple partners, and you're like, let's go build this thing. And then as things start coming in, who's going to address it? Both of you address it, or multiple people, and then that means no one does. And then there's arguments, and then you're doing more of it, and they're doing less of it, and you're resentful. It's like, if it's not to mention, I think that having different skill sets is so important, right? You fill the gaps of your skills from someone else's, but being clear on, hey, I'm going to own this piece of the business, and you own this piece. Even if it's a racy matrix or something.
That part is hard. And then the really hard part, in my opinion, is then the accountability, because not everybody ends up carrying their weight as much as everyone thought they would going in. And then it's like, those are hard conversations, right? And that's why the knowing where it would end if it separates is important to know, so that those conversations can be a little bit cleaner. Because if there's also ambiguity in what the next steps look like, then that's really ugly.
Yeah. No, 100%. If you all agree on what you're accountable and I'm accountable for, and we're like, yes, that makes sense.
Right. We
think that's fair. Then it becomes a lot,
100%,
easier to then sort of determine if things don't go well, what happened, because you didn't, hold up your end of the bargain.
100%. And then the other thing that happens and is really challenging is just the nature of growth companies is that any human is good at some stages and bad at others, right? Like I don't think I would enjoy running a big public company. Like, it's just not my shtick. And so like, whatever, there's different people who like different stages, but letting go isn't always the easiest thing in the world either. And so figuring out like where that works can be challenging.
Yeah. In terms of culture, you hire a lot of restaurant folks that worked in restaurants. And we know the obvious, reason why they work well. They understand restaurants, and you sell to restaurants.
Yep.
That part's pretty obvious. But there's more. Like, why else? Why do you think restaurant operators are such great hires in like a tech company like MarginEdge.
Yeah, it's funny. We end up spending a lot of time talking about that obvious part, but you're right. That is straightforward. They understand each other. No, I think, look, there's two things that I think are critical in this besides that area. And one is, I like to describe it as, when I was a restaurant owner, what really bothered me is when people would call who understood technology and would not really understand restaurants and then tell me, basically talk down to me, which I always thought was funny because I had started and sold a software company and they didn't know that. And it was like, really? But anyway, that sort of talking down to restaurateurs, the empathy of the true difficultness, how difficult it really is to do it, is critical. And so that empathy, I think, is part of it. And the other part of it, honestly, is people who come from the restaurant industry are hardworking. Like, they're hardworking. And, we're hiring, obviously, people who are really good at it, right? People who have been in great positions in restaurants. And as well as anyone on earth, Josh, that is a hard place to get to management of a top restaurant and to get to being a chef at a top restaurant. Like, it is a grueling process you go through to get that. And it's tough to keep it. And a lot of those people want to get out and want to do other things. They want to have kids. They want to have 9-to-5s, right? They want to still be involved in the industry and do things to help the industry. And they love the industry, but they don't mind getting off their feet for a minute. If you find those people and you give them the opportunity to come into a software company where they get to directly impact the people they care about, and they get to use their skills in a way that is meaningful, like deeply meaningful to them because it's to the industry they love, but they get to have dinner with their kids.
Yeah.
They get stock options and HSA and a 401k and a great health plan, and forget about it, right? All the tech company stuff. Fuck, that'll make people pretty happy. And so I do attribute, I like to talk about our focus on culture, all the things we do. But the reality is we have very, very strong tailwinds because we get to take people from a brutal industry, the restaurant industry, and bring them into honestly, tech is a lot easier than restaurants. Bring them into the tech industry, and they're pretty stoked about it. And so that certainly helps.
Yeah, when you haven't had a holiday off in 20 years, it's a pretty big change when you actually can go have dinner with your fam for Christmas or Thanksgiving or Hanukkah or whatever.
Yeah.
The other thing I find, I don't know if you find this as well, but I think it's definitely true, and it's actually very similar to a Broadway show or ballet. But one of the things I think that's most incredible as an attribute of restaurant operators is that they understand that chaos and curveballs are the norm, not the edge case.
Yeah.
And because every day there's a curveball. Yeah. Every day there's some amount of shit going down. Yeah. That some of it crazy, some of it not so crazy, but every day you expect something's going to go wrong. Yep. And especially in a startup, But
even as the company gets bigger, that's just true, right? Stuff happens. And the folks from the restaurant industry are very thick-skinned.
Yeah. For your mental health, the ability to accept that and not, because, the problem is if you can't accept that, then you're just constantly going to be upset. You'll be like, what? Wait a second. No, this is my job. You hired me to do this thing. And now this is happening. Right. Or no, I'm supposed to be done here. And but when you accept it, nope, this is part of the course.
Yeah, I would say not just accept. As these people, this is what they have chosen to do for years. And so they thrive on it. They're good at it. They think about it. They think on their feet. They're energized by it, right? The challenge is a good thing. And frankly, they've come up through the ranks where you have to be able to do that stuff and feel good about it.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot a little bit here because something else that I love that you do at MarginEdge is you share sort of aggregate results, data of how restaurants are doing. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's in all areas or just DC. I've seen
we do regional and national. Yeah.
So for folks out there, maybe we can kind of anchor this to small to medium restaurants. What do you see as good 4-wall unit economics as it relates to whether it's percentage based or whatever, COGS, labor, OpEx, just 4-wall EBITDA? What is good today?
Oh, good God. That is a broad question, Josh. As well as I do, that it matters dramatically a number of variables, right? Are you a multi-unit fast casual? Are you full service fine dining operating in Manhattan? Yeah. Are you, I'm wearing a t-shirt for Billy, who's one of my favorite clients who has a single unit in Fairhope, Alabama. It's all over the map. But generally speaking, 10 to 20% profit margin, I do think is possible. You hear all the time that 10% is the EBITDA number for restaurants that they strive for. I think it's actually north of that, but it depends on the concept.
10 to 20% EBITDA or prime cost, like margin after prime cost?
No, take home EBITDA.
Take home.
Yeah,
Got it.
I mean,
Okay.
I think the problem, honestly, at least, again, there's a wide range of this. You're talking about, tens and hundreds of thousands of restaurants in this whole bucket, but
You can anchor to like maybe just whatever full service.
yeah, I mean,
single.
I'd say in small businesses, in my experience, right? So I've opened a dozen restaurants, and in my experience, the restaurants that have that healthy sort of 10 plus steady EBITDA margin, obviously there's seasonality, but in a year, a 10 to 20% EBITDA margin, you can run it properly. You can staff it properly. You can have good food costs. You don't have to constantly be looking with where do you shave a dime? Where do you shave a dime? Not being able to put proper management in place. And so if you are in that sort of 0 to 10% range where you're bouncing in and out of profitability from month to month and trying to make 5 or 10 points, a lot of times you run it into the ground because you're trying to squeeze a few points and you're working so hard to squeeze a few points, you're making compromises on staffing, you're making compromises on quality. And when you do that, the revenue number comes down. And when the revenue number comes down, then you do it again, right? You're like, shit. And then you do it again. And those are the ones that end up with a bullet in their head, right? It's very, very, very hard to get out of that cycle. And so as far as, running a healthy long-term business, 10 to 20%, I think is what you want to aim for. You want to have food costs. Again, it depends if you're fine dining or whatever, but 25%, right? 30. And then prime costs similarly, 25 to 30%. So you get sort of 50 to 60%.
Yeah.
You get 8% on your rent, right? And then 10% on your direct operating and basically try to leave 10 to 20 at the top for yourself. But
Are there any like common, I mean, in case we weren't clear, like, so you're sharing mostly sales metrics of restaurants in different regions, but generally speaking, are there any common threads that you've seen across all the restaurants? I mean, you guys have thousands of restaurants that you work with.
6, not
common threads that you've seen. 6,000. 6,000 restaurants.
Yeah.
That's a lot, right? So any common
what's crazy is
threads you've seen of...
It's like 11 billion in sales across them. Common threads. Yeah, I mean, look, I can tell you the common threads, but it's the stuff you already know.
Well, you just said 11 billion in sales. Where's your payment platform there?
I know, right? That's only at 1 billion. Yeah, I don't know that I can say anything honestly, Josh. That isn't something you're going to know, right? I mean, it is food and labor. It is the managing of the controllable costs. It's coming in and getting a lease that is not out of line. I mean, one of the things that I would like to see MarginEdge do that we haven't done yet is provide some other help around like negotiating leases and knowing what to look for in that lease to make sure that you've got the flexibility because, people put personal guarantees on 10-year leases and it wipes them out. It's brutal and you don't have to do that. And so I'll be honest with you. I think the restaurant business is, on the one hand, it's all about operations. You can have a bad location, but operate it tremendously and draw a crowd. But honestly, you can get a location and operate it tremendously and people don't come also. It's I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It's a hard business.
Okay. So I could probably ask you 100 more questions about that, but we're going to move on just to spare you. We talked a little about culture, but I am curious, we can just keep this to maybe your direct reports, like your executive team, but like, how do you handle mistakes that are made, by your team?
I mean, I think we try to encourage experimentation. And so by encouraging experimentation, you are by default encouraging mistakes because you can't experiment and always get things right. Wouldn't be very good experimentation. So we certainly try it. I would say we really focus on what is the broader impact of an experiment to make sure that the experiment is controlled and not taking us down a road that is going to cause a bunch of disruptions in other areas. And that can be really hard. I mean, I think, the two big things when thinking about what mistakes are, what things fit into a category of things where a mistake is totally fine is like, what is the broader impact on it? And what is the opportunity cost, right? So like, if we're doing this experiment, does it mean we're not spending time on our core business, right? Where we have these things happening. And so, but generally speaking, I mean, I think experimentation is huge and we're always trying to learn. And I tell stories all the time about how, and I'm happy to be wrong, right? I have no problem being wrong. It's fun. I like finding out that I'm wrong because we try something and learn something different. And I have some fundamental ones. Like I thought, a big part of what MarginEdge does is we process invoices overseas, obviously. One of my favorite being wrong stories is in 2005, we were starting Wasabi. My co-founder was like, hey, he was the banker. He was like, hey, I'm going to sign up this group in India that's going to put the invoices into QuickBooks. And I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Why wouldn't you just do it? That just seems like you're adding a bunch of complexity that's useless. And we had a big fight about it. I remember to the day, like I was like, this is a terrible idea. Turns out it's a great idea. We did 135,000 invoices last week. So yeah, you experiment.
It is funny how, I don't even think it was a decade ago when we had an accountant that put in all our invoices. Yeah. I remember spreadsheets, in the early days where we would have a spreadsheet and you plug in you type in the number of the dollar amount from the invoice and the vendor, and you would have all these inputs. And at the end of the week, you'd have your spreadsheet of all the things. And
I love that you're talking about it like it's the past tense, because it's not in so many places. I mean, Josh, it's funny when we started MarginEdge, so in 2015, 10 years ago, that's what everyone did, right? That's all there was to do. And we would constantly explain like why you wouldn't. And now it is true. At least we don't have to explain it anymore, right? So we are past that phase. But you'd be amazed how many people are still doing that.
The tough thing, I don't know how do I say this the right way? It's a time savings, right? And as a restaurant operator, the 10 to 20% EBITDA is really good, right? And there's not a lot of money coming in. So when you're thinking about how to, have better economics in your business as a restaurant, it's sometimes a tough sell when you're so busy, but you're doing everything to say, oh yeah, I'll spend money for time savings.
Yeah.
When it doesn't get quantified into, a dollar amount necessarily, unless you actually get rid of that person.
No, I think that's 100% true. And I think the other thing that is unfortunate is that is true and unfortunate is that it takes time to set things up to save time. And so few people are willing to invest time to save time. They're just, putting out a fire, moving on to the next fire. And we deal with that a lot to this day. People who will say, yes, sign me up. Super excited. I get it. It's going to save time. It's going to be wonderful. But then they don't make the time to do it.
Yeah. I also am empathetic and understand why.
Yeah.
You can feel very backed into a corner. Like, okay, I understand that this can save me money, but, I just can't see myself spending this time and money and investing in this now because I don't have time. Yeah, you have to get over that hump.
And we definitely see like our success with clients correlates to their revenue level very directly, right? The higher the revenue, the more likely they've got the EBITDA to invest in the time savings and in the improvements. I mean, it's sort of like what I said about like, when revenues are going down and you're cutting costs and cutting costs and cutting costs.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing, right? If your revenues are only $500,000 a year and you're trying to break even, like it's a very hard place to be. Taking time, forget money, taking time to do anything, like you just can't. And so,
yeah,
I do think the reason I was able to have some flexibility in my own life, as we talked about in the restaurant business, is that the restaurants were reasonably high volume. Like I'll tell you a quick fun story. So we hired the guy that ran Old Ebbitt Grill, which is a restaurant in DC that does, $45 million in sales, right? A beast of a restaurant, top 5 in the country. And we were chatting one day and I was like, man, that must have been hard to run. He said what you would guess, right? He's like, no, easiest job ever. He's like, we had great revenue. So I had teams of people who all were very well paid and never quit and loved their jobs. And it was the easiest restaurant on earth to run. And you're like, yeah, right. Of course. That's the thing, right? What's hard is running that $600,000 restaurant that has exactly 0% EBITDA. It's like just trying to get over the hump, right?
Yeah, it is tough. And, I remember Danny Meyer once saying, like, you have to first generate demand, then improve your unit economics. And, there's nothing like top line growing to help motivate you to do more,
Yeah, I love those quotes, but I have owned restaurants that I have not been able to figure out how to get the top line up. And that quote would make you want to kill them, right? Like just makes you want to kill somebody, right? Like there's nothing worse than owning a restaurant that just doesn't do the number it needs to do. And you try new menu items and new marketing programs and new staffing and new, right? And you try and you try and you try and you try. Yeah, it's brutal. It's not always possible to just generate demand. I'm sorry.
Of course, it's very difficult. And at some point, you'll also hit some sort of plateau, I would assume. You just have some sort of like ceiling to the top line that you can do.
Yeah.
But somehow we all have to figure out how to grow. You pay rent based on, some sort of 10-year horizon of if I can get, if I can able to do this much max revenue out of my space and I have 10 years to do it, how long is it going to take me to get there? Anyways, that's a longer conversation, but I'm curious, I've been asking this a lot lately. What makes you really angry? Like what's the thing at work specifically that like boils your blood?
Ooh, that's a good one. What is
I can give you a backstory if you want.
Sure, that gives me a second to think too as you do it.
Sure. Yeah. So I was at this like CEO retreat like a couple months ago. And there was this like facilitator that was, she was great. And she did this exercise, and that's all she asked was like, well, what makes you really angry? And, we would also came up with all of our things. And the idea was to sort of distill this down to, why does that make you angry? Why does that thing make you angry? Into a personal value of yours. And it's so clear how, like, when you distill down the thing that makes you angry, if you look deeper into why it makes you angry, it's 99% of the time it's some very deep personal core value of yours.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think for me, there's like the hard part about the question is trying to differentiate between what I would call day-to-day stress, which will increase my temperature, right? But I don't think that gets at the heart of what you're really asking, which is, no, what makes you angry? Like, what gets like really under your skin where you're emotionally engaged as opposed to just frustrated and stressed, right? And I think if I think about the anger thing, it generally is around mistreatment of individuals. And the individuals could be clients, they could be employees, they could be whatever. But if I get the vibe that someone is, all sorts of things happen, right? But if someone is treating another person in a way that is like not just, that's just mean or unfair or fake or like, that stuff like that, my temperature goes up. I think I'm a big believer that once you get angry, you've lost. So I don't think even if you have the best reason to be angry, like if you're operating out of anger, you're going to fuck it up. There's no way you're going to get to a good place out of anger. So I mean, I get angry, but I try not to. I think I probably have an anger gene that is stronger than I would like. And so it's something I have struggled with, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. It's sort of, if you distill that down, you really value respect or kindness or...
I just think it's so important, right? And it's funny, you said business, not personal. I tend to think about personal stuff before business. And I will tell you, the one thing that makes me the angriest in my family is, and it doesn't happen now, it used to happen when my kids were young, but I had one child that would pick on another child. And like nothing would make me angrier. Like I would just go red. Like the idea that one was hurting another one, like not acceptable, right? In any world. And like, and I would it would go to the core, right? Like that was not a thing that could happen. And it was something we struggled with for a while.
Yeah, that's a tough one. What I find tough with that, just in terms of parenting, is because it happens, with my kids as well, and they're younger. But like,
this is when they were younger,
Yeah, it's not. They're not innately bad. But they're doing a thing that's bad, and you have to be curious as to I wonder why they're doing. I mean, obviously they're exploring, probably
and
like trying to figure this thing out.
They're wrestling and they're playing, and one's stronger than the other. Fine, like that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, like picking on, like taking it too far. It's our job as parents to figure out how do you dial that back? Like just screaming at them is obviously not the solution, right? You got to figure out like what's driving that, and how can you change the behavior?
Yeah. You have to help them understand, or at least tell them why like, hey, it seems like maybe you're, and because I get so pissed when my son will like take a toy from Pearl, like, and I'm like, dude, give that back. And then 5 minutes later, he'll like complain that she's playing with the toy that he wants. And I'm like, what the fuck? Stop being an asshole. But he's not, it's just, they're kids. They don't know. And that helps me a lot, honestly. Like, just people do things because of some feeling that they're having. So often, like whatever's happening, with one of your team members or something, typically there's something else going on.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we had something just this week with our exec team where there was more tension than I would like around a thing. And I've spent some time talking to team members and trying to diffuse it and figure out what's behind it. And just had a meeting this morning where I think we got to the heart of it, which was like miscommunication, where people were literally using the same words. Like the words were the same, but they actually meant something different. They were literally talking about different things, but using the same words. And by using those words, they were stepping on each other's toes completely, right? And instead of like talking it through, they just got angry. And when they got angry, it was like, pow, and then forget about it, right? And then like, so literally with conversations with each of them, trying to just solve what the heck was that all about. And you're like, oh, you guys aren't even mad at each other about anything. You're literally saying different things. And once you both understand what you've actually meant, this thing is not even a thing, right? Yeah. But it's just easy for us to like, especially as, stress levels get high, right? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of pressure on what we're doing. And so there's less room for allowing each person to have their
Yeah, and
Nice.
we all have that. I have that with my wife all the time. We're like, we'll have an argument for like a whole day, and I'm like, wait a second, you were talking about that? I was talking about this.
Yeah, this is not unique to business for sure.
Yeah, yeah. If you had to ask, like, you call it meeple, is what you call them, right?
Yeah, I
Margin
did
Edge?
not come up with that one. I don't particularly
Okay.
love it.
All right. Well, people that work at MarginEdge.
Yeah.
If you had to ask them like why they work there, what do you think that someone would say?
Yeah, I mean, we do have the surveys and we do this, and so we get this a lot, and we do get, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but we do get a lot of people say that they want to help the restaurant industry. They come from the restaurant industry, and honestly, even a lot of the people that are software developers and people who didn't come from the industry, because 70 to 80% of our people did, and we talk about it a lot, these developers recognize that what they're building is affecting those people in a meaningful way. And so I know it sounds cheesy and canned, but it is actually true. And it's what I personally believe also. Like, we had a thing yesterday where a relatively new person who's in client services asked me if I would talk to the CFO of a restaurant group. And I was like, yeah, I would love to. And she's like, oh, that's so great. You're willing to do that. And I was like, let me just level set with you. I want to do that. Like, I enjoy doing that. And the more people you can find in the industry that want to take time to talk to me, I'm game, right? Like, so right? Like, we genuinely enjoy the group we work with and engaging with the group we work with. And because of that, like, it's just sort of self-fulfilling.
Yeah. It's so funny. I've been asking this question lately, and this week, just in terms of time stamping this, like I did 3 recordings this week, which I don't typically do. And it was you, Jordan from 7 Shifts.
Making me feel special. Oh, I love Jordan. Jordan's a great guy.
Yeah, he's great. And Nabil from Lunchbox. Identical answer for all 3 of you.
That's funny. I don't know Nabil. I know Jordan, and I know Jordan's backstory is not that different from ours, so it makes sense.
Very similar. Yeah, very similar. He was an engineer, and he's so sharp. I love that guy.
Yeah, we actually asked him. He's going to come down and do our all hands. So we have 250 people flying in March, and he's going to give a keynote.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Mr. Bo, is there anything that I didn't ask you today that you think we should talk about?
Oh, man. I don't know. One thing I always like to talk about we talked a lot about my background in entrepreneurship. One thing I like to talk about that is also, I think, a little bit counter to what people hear normally is, there's a lot of like, entrepreneurship is great. Everyone should follow their dream and create the company they always wanted, that kind of thing. And I like to give the counter speech that, sure, there's positive stuff about entrepreneurship, but it really isn't for everyone. And that there's a lot of sort of extra baggage that goes with being an entrepreneur that you don't get otherwise. And I think particularly for restaurant owners, like, it looks great to be a restaurant owner, and you're like, your neighbors, like, to this day, my neighbor's like, oh my God, you own Wasabi, that one restaurant. And even though MarginEdge is worth 100 times as much as Wasabi is, it's sexier that I own Wasabi. But the stress that you take home at night as an entrepreneur, and obviously you know this, Josh, you're an entrepreneur yourself, it's just a different thing, and it's not for everybody, and that people should think deeply before they really go into it.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And it's funny, somebody said something to me last week, this guy Brandon from a company called Byte, that really, I thought was really at least interesting. I don't know how much I definitely agree, but there are levels to it. And he said, if you're working at a startup, you're an entrepreneur. Because the definition of an entrepreneur is running a business where you're taking on significant financial risk to do so. And in any startup, there's a lot of risk, right? You're going from a job where there's probably a lot more security to something where there's less.
Yeah.
But there's certainly risk. And so there's some level of entrepreneurship in deciding the first 5-6 employees at a company.
Yeah, but so where I would differ, and God bless anybody willing to work for a startup, I get it, there is financial risk, and I agree with you. But where I would differ is that when you are the entrepreneur or one of the co-founders, your ego and personal value, how people perceive you, gets wrapped up in a way. Like, if you say, hey, I joined a startup and it failed, people are like, I bet that was interesting. If you're like, hey, I started a company and it failed, they're like, loser, right? Like, there's a different fucking thing.
I 100% agree. And that's why I'm sort of torn, because I think it's a very novel and interesting notion.
And also, like, when we didn't have much pay, the other 4 people got paid and the co-founders didn't, right?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
When somebody had to put their house up because Wasabi's was broke and we needed to extend our loans, I had to put my house on the line. So level.
Probably a good definition, like any entrepreneur that I'm sure I've gone, in previous businesses, a year plus without paying myself and putting all my savings into into something, and it's incredible risk. And it's funny you said it's not just the financial risk; it's also this personal risk of it's you. There's no way of separating it from yourself. We talk about like, I separate my business from my personal. That's true, but it is you. You've built something, and if it fails, there's a lot more. There's a lot more pressure there.
You like it or not. And honestly, almost always there's friends and family money. I mean, I tell people one of the hardest things about Wasabi, because we struggled for years, was I took a lot of friends and family money. I put my own money in it. So it's not like I was taking others and not doing it myself. But like I had to go to Thanksgiving and have a bunch of people around a table that I'd taken their money and put it in Wasabi, and Wasabi wasn't doing well. And that's a different level of stress than it's a thing.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. And thanks for taking time today.
Thank you, Josh. Enjoyed it. Always enjoy talking to you.
Thanks for tuning into the Mies podcast. The music from the show is a remix of the song Art Mirror by an old friend, hip-hop artist, Fresh Daily. For show notes and more, visit getmees.com/podcast. That's GETMEEZ.com/podcast. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love it if you can share it with fellow entrepreneurs and culinary pros, and give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. Keep innovating, don't settle, make today a little bit better than yesterday, and remember, it's impossible for us to learn what we think we already know. See you next time.